going to take a look at some of the basics of the data grid component today. Arguably one of the most powerful components in the Flex framework, certainly one of the most used, and is ideal for displaying and manipulating data. You'll see it a lot of the time without realizing it. But it can be a little tricky for people to get used to working with if they're not familiar with them. So let's run through the code that I've got here. I've defined and created an array collection here with an ID of username. It's got some objects in there. We have, on each of the objects, we have these properties. We have an F name, an L name, and an age. And as you can see, we essentially have two rows of data here, two objects of data. And on this data grid down here, we've got a width and a height and a location. And the data provider is pointing to this array collection up here, this user array. So let's just go ahead and run that. This is a data grid in its most basic form. And you can see what happens is it automatically generates a column for each of the properties of the data up here. And we have age, an F name, and L name. Now that's great, but not really useful to us. We need to format this a little bit here and make things a little more interesting, a little more user-friendly. So let's go ahead and do that. I think the first thing we need to do is obviously change these column names to be something a little more descriptive and useful to the end user. So to do that, I'm going to paste some code in here to save some time and explain it. We define the columns property, and as you can see, what I've done is defined 3 columns, and you have these properties, the header text and the data field. So the data field is pointing to the F name and the L name and the age. And what we're going to do is change the header text here, and no surprises I'm sure, we'll change this one to first name, last name, and finally age. So let's just run that again. And sure enough, now we're getting the first name, last name, and age, and seeing the properties there. So that's a little more user-friendly. Now, what about if you need to take some of this data and concatenate it together? Maybe instead of saying first name and last name and age, you want to have just the complete name and the age. So what we need to do for that is let's go and figure out some code for this. And it's actually a lot simpler than you might think. To do it, what we do is we replace the data field with a custom function that we specify. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove the last name here since we're not going to need this column at all. And we're going to rename this column so that the header says named. And we don't want to use this data field pointing to the first name because that's just going to show us the first name. So let's just remove that. Now what we have in here is this function here called label function. And what we specify is a name for a custom function that we have to write. And what happens is, what we're telling the data grid to do is, every time you go to put a row of data on the screen, call this custom function that we're going to specify here and do whatever we're going to tell it to do, and it's going to return a string, and then it's going to display that string on the screen. So I need to give it a function name. I'm just going to call it my function. And now, of course, what we need to do is go up here and add a script block. And we need to define and code up this function. Now, there's a couple of properties here I'll go over in a second. Oops, that needs to be a string. It's going to return a string. And so there's our basic code there. Right, so we have to specify some properties that it's going to expect here. And let's just go over those. What I'm going to do, I'm going to paste some code in here again and explain it to you. So it's going to expect 2 different things. We have this one called item of type object. Traditionally, you sort of see this one called item. It's kind of if you see it in code, most people call it item. And then we have a column, which is a data grid column. So what we're going to do here, the item going in is that row of data from the array collection up here. And then the column, of course, is going to be whatever column we want to affect. So what I'm going to do in the code here, I'm just going to return, and we're going to say item.fname, so that's the first name property that you can see up here, plus, and we'll put a space in there, and then another plus so we can concatenate the strings, and I'm going to say L name. So we're taking the first name and the L name and the last name, putting them together with a space in the middle. Right, so what we'll do is we'll now go ahead and run this. So just to recap over what we've done, We've taken out one of the columns. We've renamed this one. In fact, let's make this username to make it clear that it's going to be both parts of the name together. We've replaced the data field with calling this custom function here, my function, and we don't specify here when we're calling it any of the parameters. They're just going to be expected. So we have these two parameters here, and when it calls the function, it's going to take the current row of data and it's going to take the first name and the last name, add them together with a space in the middle, return that as a string, as you can see up here, and then that string is essentially what gets displayed in this data grid column. So you could do any sort of fancy coding in here, date formatting, anything you want to take place, you put in this function up here. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. And so sure enough, now we have this column username and we have the two names. I'll just move it here so you can compare it with the data. We've concatenated the names here. We've got Tomcat and Jerry Mouse and plus the age. So there's a couple of little basic things that you can do to get started with data grids. There's so much you can do with it, but I just wanted to give you the basics to get up and running and start playing with it. So I hope that's been useful. Check out uibuzz.com for more content and let us know what you think. Thank you.